Welcome to Everyone Loves Guitar, where we get to sit down and talk with interesting professional guitar players and related music industry experts. If you love playing guitar, stick around. You're in the right place. Hey, this is Craig Garber from Everyone Loves Guitar, and before we start today's show, I wanted to talk to all the guitar players out there about something really interesting. If you're a guitar player, or probably any other kind of musician, or if you know a musician who's looking to make some more money without having to tour or go on the road, or put up with any of the other BS that musicians normally have to deal with, then what I'm about to tell you is probably the most exciting and important message you'll ever hear. As a business guy who just happens to play guitar, one of the first things I realized after interviewing, say, the first 50 or so guitar players was that if I was going to get into this business today, the first thing I'd look at doing is learning how to license your music. And by licensing music, I mean getting your music inserted into movies, television shows, and commercials. And here's why. There are 4 reasons, actually. First of all, focusing on record deals, publishing, and touring means that you're putting your destiny in someone else's hands. You're at the whim of someone who has literally thousands of other people competing for their attention, many of whom, frankly, may have music with more commercial appeal than your music has, which means you get what's ever left over as far as attention from that particular manager, publisher, publicist, or booking agent, right? And I don't know how you feel, but for me, I'm totally uncomfortable leaving my destiny and my family's financial future up to someone else. Second, I've learned in business that if you work in areas that are less competitive and not as crowded, your likelihood of success goes up dramatically. And there are way less people competing to have their music licensed than there are trying to make records, get their songs published, and go on tour. In fact, there are so many people competing to play music, the average working musician today, by and large, earns the same or less money than they were making back in the 1970s and 1980s. Third, in the licensing business, it's not unusual to have one or more of your songs wind up paying you multiple times over and over again. In some cases, day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. In fact, some songs you even get paid on multiple times over from a variety of sources because different people wind up licensing that same song from you. Many times you get paid for songs you recorded months or even years ago. So no work you do is ever wasted. Even if a particular song doesn't get picked up right now, there's a very good chance it can get picked up later. And the more music you write, the more opportunities you get for placements. The more placements, the more money you make, both up front as income from licensing fees and on the backside in terms of royalties for years to come. And the fourth reason I like this industry is that a free ebook has just been published, which pretty much takes you by the hand and shows you step by step how to get your music licensed. The book is less than 20 pages long, and it was written by Mike Elsner, who I interviewed in episode number 167 of this show. Mike's been doing this for over 14 years, and he's actually had over 2,000 songs licensed at this point in time. Now, I want you to pay attention to something because that means he's getting paid to license almost 150 songs per year. Now, keep in mind, most successful career musicians don't even get paid for 150 songs in total over a 30 or 40-year career, yet Mike's getting paid for this on an annual basis. And in this free ebook, you'll discover the 4 simple steps to licensing success, including step 1, which actually shows you how to get paid a significant upfront licensing fee as well as quarterly royalties. You'll learn how to get paid for learning how to play a new instrument. And I'm not kidding. He actually shows you an example of he basically practiced a new instrument and he licensed all the songs, and he walks you through this. In step 2, you'll learn how to quickly expand your song catalog by 5 to 6 times its current size without having to create literally anything new. That's right, you'll learn how to easily turn 10 songs into 50 to 60 songs in less than 5 minutes each, and each one of those new songs now becomes another new asset you can sell. You'll learn what to do, and maybe even more important, what not to do to get your music quickly noticed by music supervisors. And this one simple nugget alone easily makes the difference between regularly getting your music licensed and never getting it licensed at all. He'll show you 4 ways to get paid to license your music, and then you get to pick and choose which one of those 4 ways works best for you. And you'll also get to uncover little-known secrets to using common websites online to get free names of people who would want to license your music. And the other cool thing I like about this business is that you can run it all from your home studio. No ivory tower record label executives telling you what to play and how to play it, and no shady managers or backroom publishers with their own agenda telling you what to do. So download Mike's free ebook on music licensing right now. Just go to everyonelovesguitar.com/Mike. That's everyonelovesguitar.com/Mike, M-I-K-E. That's it, real simple. Let me know how you like the book, and now let's get on with the show. Hey, everybody, this is Craig Garber from Everyone Loves Guitar, and we've got a great guitar player and a really cool guy to talk with today. We're with Stephen Sheehan. Stephen came to Nashville in 1983. Between 83 and 91, he toured worldwide with the Judds, playing acoustic guitar, lead acoustic guitar, harmonica, and background vocals. From 95 to 98, he toured with Randy Travis, again playing acoustic guitar. From 2007 to 2009, he was playing acoustic guitar occasionally with Trisha Yearwood. He's appeared on the following TV shows at a minimum: Late Show, Letterman, Tonight Show, Johnny Carson, Grand Ole Opry, CMA Awards, the ACM Awards, and the American Music Awards. Between 92 and the present, he's played on literally thousands of sessions, ranging from major label projects, publishing demos, jingles, and TV soundtracks. His album credits include Toby Keith, Trisha Yearwood, Jonathan Cain from Journey, Dierks Bentley, Alabama, Kenny Rogers, Montgomery Gentry, Nashville, ABC TV Tracks, and literally thousands of others. His writing credits include cuts across multiple genres, which is really cool that someone could write in so many different styles, including country, bluegrass, and internationally. His songs have been licensed for TV and film soundtrack use. He's got a preference for vintage instruments and amplifiers, and we'll discuss this today. Man, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Oh, man, I'm so glad to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
1983, you come to Nashville.
Yeah.
What prompted you to come?
At the time, I was living in eastern Tennessee, in Johnson City. I married for the first time when I was really young. I was 21 or 22. And my wife and I, we were living and working there. There was a really active traditional music scene in eastern Tennessee. And I was really into that music and exploring that stuff. And so I was working in several bands, acoustic flavored bands. I also at the time was way into jazz guitar. And I never told anybody this, but at the time I was fronting a jazz trio, had a house gig, some restaurant house gig we were doing on Friday nights, and then Saturday nights and other nights of the week, I was playing in these bluegrass and acoustic flavored bands. And after a number of years of doing that, we kind of had set our sights on Nashville. We just didn't know quite how to get there. And then at the 11th hour, a job opportunity opened up for my then wife. And that gave us the opportunity to move here. And we did so cold without really knowing anybody in town. But it was like eastern Tennessee was fairly, I don't want to say secluded, but it was a mountain community, not very urban. And man, coming to Nashville at that point in our lives, it was like moving to Oz. There was so much going on, for obvious reasons, getting here and not knowing anyone and trying to figure out how this was going to work and how to make a living. It just, for about 6 months, my full-time job was just being out every night, meeting as many people as I could, pounding flesh, doing all that stuff. And after a couple of months, a little bit of work started coming in, some road gigs, and that was kind of the extent of it. But we were here, and at that point, I was absolutely committed. I didn't know what was going to happen. I just knew that I wanted to be here. I wanted to make it work, and I wasn't going to take no for an answer. After I hadn't been here maybe 9 months and had worked a little bit, had done a bit of road work. None of it was very high visibility by any means, but I got this cold call from a guy named Don Potter. Don at the time was a pretty successful session player. And he told me that he had been working on this project with a couple of girls. They were called the Judds. And they had some road dates coming up. And his session schedule was starting to heat up. And he didn't think he could commit to going out of town with them. And he just threw the idea out and asked me if I'd be interested. And like, honestly, I didn't know who the hell they were. I hadn't heard them on the radio, but I was really intrigued by the offer. And it was the first time my phone had rang that anything of a really serious professional opportunity had been thrown my way. So I agreed to it. I got off the phone. I immediately started searching the radio, and I heard the Judds. I heard their first single, and I was like floored. I was absolutely knocked out. And then at that point, it was like, this is something I really want. It took a couple of months for things to kind of fall in place, but I got the gig. And starting, I think, in the summer of '84, somewhere in the summer, I went out on their first tour, which was 6 weeks of. It was a 6-week tour. The first couple of weeks, we opened shows for Neil Young all across Canada.
Holy shit.
It was a big deal.
Wow.
And I don't know how the hell they got booked on this as an open act. Because, I mean, Neil was selling out all the hockey arenas across the country. And here come these two girls with this little acoustic band that nobody had ever heard of. But that's where it started, man. It was a crazy, crazy good experience. And that 6-week tour for me wound up being about a 9-year gig.
Wow. So a few questions for you.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Number one, you never told anybody that you fronted a traditional jazz band. Why?
It wasn't relevant to working here.
Okay.
It's a good feather in the cap, and it's something that I did, and you know, I could pursue that as a hobby, but that had nothing to do with playing commercial music in Nashville.
Right. Is that your thing, jazz? I mean, like, if you have to, do you listen to jazz records? Is that like the music you like to listen to and enjoy the most? Where you feel home, I guess?
That's one genre that feels at home. Yeah, I adore jazz guitar. I really do. I'm beginning to. I really hadn't explored that in a lot of years, and I'm kind of coming back around to it. I recently bought myself a jazz box, which I haven't owned in years.
Awesome.
And and I'm having a lot of fun just sort of trying to flex those muscles again, and learn some tunes. But strictly, it's really just a hobby.
Awesome. That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that, man. Okay, second question.
Yeah.
How good did you feel when you got that phone call from Don Potter, even though you didn't know the Judds, even though you didn't know anything, basically? That had to, like, kind of make you almost feel like, I guess I am a real musician. I'm getting a call in Nashville. I'm getting a call from a guy, who's a respectable guy, wants me to do this gig.
It wasn't a cut and dry conversation. It was, we talked for about an hour on the phone, and it became clear to me pretty quickly that he wasn't just looking for a guitar player. He was looking for the right fit for these artists. And he had already spent a considerable amount of time with them, and a couple of years of pre-production and making a record, and he had gone out and played some shows with them, and they really were music virgins in a sense. They had no performance experience. They learned how to sing around the kitchen. They caught the ear of a really great record producer. They made a record, all that stuff. I mean, that was their background. So Potter was looking for someone who not only could play the musical parts, be the guitar player, but someone with the personality type, someone solid enough to be able to handle the gig and to handle two artists that had zero experience in terms of performance and being on the road. Of course, I'm trying to process all that. What I'm hearing is, I need a guitar player. So I'm thinking, hey, I need a job.
Yeah, sounds like a fit.
And so it took a couple of months because he had committed to going out. And at that point, they really were they were going around the country playing some radio, doing radio stuff, and playing a few industry-sponsored showcases. They really hadn't started a formal tour yet. So Potter agreed to continue to do those things. My formal, it wasn't an audition so much as Don invited me to his home. And I went over there and literally spent a day with him and his wife. And that was kind of my audition.
Just to see the hang and the.
It was all about the hang. Yeah. And we probably talked for 3 or 4 hours before we ever picked up a guitar. And by the end of that day, I really felt like, and for him, and at the time with all the people involved, it was pretty significant, but I felt like he was passing the baton off to me. And that was the point at which I felt like, wow, I'm here. I'm really part of something. I mean, that to me, that was this huge confidence boost. And then it was kind of up to me, either take it and run with it or not. Fortunately, I ran with it. and without getting into it really was a 9-year run. I stayed with that act until basically they called it quits. But in all that time, at least back in those days, and I think it was an unwritten rule, but the way Nashville worked, you either were a traveling, touring musician, or you worked in town and you played sessions. And there was a line drawn, and very, very few people got to cross that line. So for all those years, I put all my time and energy into being part of this act and touring. And when that was done, probably the last couple of years of that gig, I really had my sights set on being in Nashville. At that point, I'd logged a lot of years on the road. I'd seen a good part of the world. I'd done that. I really wanted to get into recording. I just didn't know how the hell to do it. I really didn't. But by the time that act called it quits, that seemed like a pretty good opportunity. A number of the guys that I had worked with in that band went on when Winona Judd launched her solo career. A number of those band guys stayed with her. I bailed. And it was really odd after I thought I lived in Nashville. I'd been here at that point 10 years, but I really didn't know anything about the town itself. I'd spent most of that time on the road. And these were years where we literally were working well over 250 days a year plus travel. So my time, I was gone.
Yeah, you were gone. Yeah.
Literally gone. And that didn't afford me the opportunity to be here and to learn about the whole scene in town and how it worked and how to get involved in it. So anyway, fast forward, the Judds gig is over, and it's like, for me, it was like back to square one.
It was almost like you just got back to town again in 1983, in a sense.
Exactly. It was like I just moved here. And it was like a whole new set of rules. And I only knew a couple of guys, including Don Potter, who were actively playing sessions. And I talked to both the guys that I knew. They're both guitar players, and they had some pretty sage advice, which boiled down to basically to just keep your nose to the grindstone. Make sure you're ready when the phone rings. Have your gear together. Pretty basic, but I thought, now looking back, I think it was the exact thing that I needed to hear. And what I learned is that over the years is that nobody gives this stuff away. You know, it's really, I think Nashville is a place that really rewards people who really dig in and aren't here for any, there's no overnight success. There's no quick way to go about this. But I think Nashville recognizes hard work, and I think they reward that. Hard work typically means putting in a number of years. And of course, that was the big unknown for me. I just came off what at the time was a very successful road gig. And for that period of time, the money was really good. And, suddenly walking away from all of that and facing the idea of no income, zero, raising a child, that was pretty damn frightening. And it was also a good incentive. It was it was kind of back to square one. It was just making the rounds across town, meeting songwriters, meeting other players, working the phone, just doing whatever I could think of. And in my case, because one of my other passions really was songwriting, that was sort of the gateway for me. It was in meeting and working with writers, all of whom eventually just started calling me to play on their projects. That's sort of what kind of springboarded my career, I think, my session career. That's probably a good stop point. I don't know if I hope I answered the question. I feel like
absolutely. No, it's great, man. So I just had one more question relative to that. Did you get a chance to sit with Neil Young at all?
No, unfortunately, I was able to hang on the side of the stage every night and watch a show. But Neil at the time, boy, he was surrounded by a posse of security. There was one night we had finished our set, and it was one of those hockey arenas of really cavernous lower levels. And I started wandering around backstage and went down this tunnel to a lower level of someplace I probably shouldn't have been, but I literally walked around a corner and ran into Neil and his posse. And they just very efficiently and very quickly moved me out of the way, man. I mean, it was a Secret Service move.
Wow.
But anyway, it was brilliant. That was a really, really great experience. And
was that during like his Electric Rust years?
It was just after the Rust project.
Okay. So he was doing like the kind of off stuff, like the disco-ish stuff?
It was post the disco thing. It was kind of a little more back to a little closer to Harvest, at least for the band that he had at the time. And I remember meeting his guitar tech. And I grew up, I loved Buffalo Springfield and all the offshoots of that band, and Crosby, Stills, Nash Young. I loved all that stuff. But being a guitar player and back then kind of a guitar geeky guy, I got to know his guitar tech. And Neil had the entire collection of instruments on the road that he had in all of his famous photos and on all the album covers. And man, I just ate that stuff up.
Yeah, I bet.
And this is a little sideline, but many, many years later, I was hired to work on this record project. ironically, it was another mother and two daughter act, but they were based in Northern California, and they were signed to Capitol Records.
That is very weird. What's the likelihood of that, man?
I don't know, man. That was crazy.
That's really weird.
It was an LA-based producer, and I got hired to work on this thing. And on one of the rounds of recording, we all met in LA, and I guess it was the first one, and we were driving up to Sonoma. And on the way, we stopped at Neil Young's Guitar Tech has a instrument rental company, and we stopped at his house. And that was like, after all these years seeing this guy again, of course, many years older, but he still works for Neil, but his sideline business was basically instrument rental. He had an entire house full of, you name it.
Wow.
He had of everything. And the producer had big eyes, and he had a fat wallet and a budget. So we just wiped the guy out, man. We loaded up the cars and took all this junk up to the studio just because we could.
Sure.
But it was, anyway, that was a little.
That is cool.
Kind of full circle with the mother-daughter act and with the Neil Young connection. It was kind of crazy.
So did you get to see Neil's, the Les Paul, the Black Beauty with the 3 pickups?
He played that guitar every night. He played his White Falcon.
Wow.
He had he had a whole collection of Martins, and had his pump organ or whatever. No, it wasn't a pump organ. It was a larger instrument than that. Actually, many years later, Neil did a solo tour. I think he's actually done several of them, but he did his first solo tour when he came to town. He played at the Opry House, and my wife and I went to see the show. And Neil sat front center. His entire acoustic guitar collection was surrounding him. And he just came out, he sat down, and every guitar was tuned specific to a particular song on a set list. And he would just grab an instrument and play a song. He'd put it back in the stand. He'd grab another one. And you could tell he was doing it on the fly, because he would just turn around and look at guitars, and he would zone in on one and he would grab it. And that meant in his head, he already knew what song he was going to play. And he was maybe 6 songs into the set before he ever acknowledged the audience. And he was playing we were pretty far back, but I could tell he was playing it was a vintage Martin. And the first words he said to the audience were, "That was Hank Williams' guitar."
Wow.
It's like, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I can't top that. Thanks a lot.
Wow, that's a great story, man. So I want to ask you about, you've played with a bunch of artists and really good artists. And I was curious if you can talk about, for each of these people, how you got the gig and the nature of what you were doing, and maybe a cool or interesting story or two about working with them. And then if there was any takeaways, like did you learn anything either about performing, about the business end, about yourself, whatever. So let's start with Randy Travis.
Randy, throughout the late 80s up through the early 90s, like there was a period here when there was sort of this traditionalist revival. And I think in some ways, if you cycled back, I think a lot of it goes back to Emmylou Harris and the Hot Band, and Ricky Skaggs in particular. I think what Skaggs did and the success that he got on country radio, on commercial radio, I think in a lot of ways that segued right to the Judds. It was at the point in time when their record first came out, Nashville was, production-wise, those were pretty forgettable years. Nashville discovered a DX7, and they were making all these horrible DX7-based records and, using first-generation drum machines, and there was some really horrible stuff going on. Suddenly, the Judds came out, acoustic-based records that just went nuts. I mean, their career just skyrocketed. And Randy Travis came out right just on the cusp of that, followed by Alan Jackson. And there was a period of years there where that stuff was really successful. For a number of years, the Judds and Randy Travis co-headlined a lot of shows. And so consequently, I got to know their organization. After I had sort of left the road, I was probably 3 or 4 years into trying to establish a session career when I got a call from Travis's management. And their day-to-day guy was a guy I remember from the road. And at the time, Randy really wasn't working very much. He was only like maybe working 30 or 40 days a year. And I was really honest. I said, hey, I love Randy. I said, but I'm really trying to be here in town. And when they sort of laid it out for me, he basically was working weekends from the springtime up through Christmas. And that was it. And it kind of made sense. On a lot of levels, but just practically, I knew that I could make it work. I could be in town Monday to Friday or Monday to Thursday, play sessions. I could jump on his bus or fly out and meet him wherever I had to and play weekend shows and still be back and not really tell anybody that I was doing that and not try to interrupt whatever progress I had made within my session career. I think I worked with Randy for about 3 years, and it was golden. It was so much fun. Number one, that his band, a bunch of guys that all really great players who had all been with him for a long time. They were all adults. They were settled. The whole vibe on the bus was very, very chill. And these guys were all just fanatical about traditional country music. It was a great hang for me. I can't say enough good things about Randy Travis himself. He is such an easygoing guy. And really, here's the deal. It all came down to this. The best part of that gig was about 30 minutes every day before showtime. Randy would come by himself no one else was allowed. He would come into the band dressing room, he'd grab a guitar, he'd hang out, and he'd just start singing tunes. And he had this amazing catalog of Haggard, Lefty Frizzell, Don Gibson, Johnny Cash. I mean, the guy, he was a walking music encyclopedia. And it seemed like, and I think in a lot of ways that he actually enjoyed that half hour maybe more than he enjoyed being on stage. Because the stage show it never changed, you know. You'd rehearse a show in January or whenever, and you'd go out and you'd play the same 75-minute set basically every night. But for that 30 minutes, he could come in and hang with a bunch of guys and just sing some tunes, and just for the pure joy of it. And that was the greatest part of that gig for me.
And what a cool way to warm up.
Absolutely.
I mean, it doesn't get any better than that.
It doesn't. And,
wow.
And anyway, that was the deal for me on that one. I'll never forget, man. This was a gig in Florida, somewhere in South Florida. We finished the gig, and management was out, and they said, "Hey, we need to have a band meeting." And that's like the dreaded call.
Yeah, of course.
The band meeting, and so. It turns out that Randy had signed with a new label deal. He'd been on Warner Brothers for many years, and he really wasn't on radio at this point. But his career had been so successful. He had built up such a massive audience that he was still able to tour pretty successfully. But he wanted to get back on radio. Anyway, they'd signed to DreamWorks Records, and management was informing us that they were gearing up for a big year the following year. And man, I just processed that. And that was the night I gave my notice. I was just like, you know what? I love you guys, but my job is at home.
Yeah.
And that's really where I want to be. And as it turned out, their big gearing up never really amounted to that big. It wasn't a huge increase in the number of tour dates they played. I probably could have stayed there and managed, but I felt like that was the right amount of time to have been there, and I have no regrets whatsoever about that. But I felt like it was time to get back home and just put all my energy into being here.
Did you feel like, I know I've had situations where I've like fired a client. It hasn't happened often, but whenever it's happened, I've kind of, like the first time especially it happened, I felt so good because, you know, I made the decision and, you know, you're not desperate for money. Did you kind of have that feeling? And there's not with bitterness or acrimony, that like, it had to be like a bit of a confidence builder that you could say that.
It was, and it was after I gave him my notice, I walked away. I immediately kind of second guessed myself. You know, I'm looking around thinking, man, I really like these guys. This is a great little arrangement. I hope I'm making the right move. I think I did. I will say this. I didn't see Randy again. Well, I'll take that back. Their management called me a few times over the years. My chair got filled. They had a really great guy that came in behind me. He was a great player, great singer. But there were a few times when, for whatever reason, he had to sub out a gig, and management continued to call me for about 5 years. And I went out and I played a couple of one-off dates with Randy. And it was just fun. It's like old homecoming, you know. Cool. And absolutely no pressure. I just show up, I play the gig, I come home, done.
Yeah.
That was really fun. I played on Randy's, I played on his last recording session. He had a absolutely catastrophic accident that resulted in a stroke that, you know, absolutely just changed his life and really ended his career. But several weeks before that happened, I was in the studio with him, and we hadn't seen each other for a number of years, and it was just, boy, he looked great. He was confident. He was in really good voice, and once again, man, he was trying to take another shot at getting back on radio and reviving a career, and just, you know, sadly, a few weeks later, he had a stroke, and that was that. But that session meant a whole lot to me. I was just really, really treasure having been there and being part of that.
Yeah, man, I'm glad you got to do that. Talk about Jonathan Cain.
Jonathan, wow. Man, there's a talent. I first met John, he and his family were living in California at the time, but I think he may have already, he and his wife may already have set their sights on being in Nashville. But he started making trips here with he had a teenage daughter, Madeline. I think at that time, Madeline was maybe 13 years old. And, you know, she was trying to follow in the footsteps of the family business. She was writing some songs, and Jonathan wanted to encourage and to try to help develop his daughter's talent. And honestly, I don't know how he chose this particular studio, but there's a buddy of mine here in town. Everybody knows Paul Skolton. Paul's a drummer. He's also a studio owner, and has run a really successful business here, probably for about 30 years. Somehow John got a hold of Paul's name, and he booked the studio, and he left it up to Paul to book the players that he needed. And I'd worked with Paul off and on for a long time, and so I got the call. And He just booked us for a session. I don't think he told us who it was for. We didn't really have any info. Anyway, we show up and it's John and his daughter. And that one session led into about a dozen others. John kept commuting back and forth with his daughter, Madeline. And then eventually he relocated his family here. And at that point, this little band that had been working on his daughter's project, we kind of gotten pretty tight. And we started doing more work for his daughter. Meanwhile, John he and his family got settled in here. He built his own studio in Berry Hill. And just through that association, when John started producing stuff over at his place, he was calling me. And then a few times he would call us in, and we started demoing Jonathan Cain songs, new songs. And like every songwriter in town, John was competing with everybody else, and he wasn't getting much traction with his new stuff. So he booked the same band on a number of sessions. We basically went in and recut all the big Journey hits. We recut them. Like in John's words, he wanted to Nashville-ize the Journey songs, and that was 2 or 3 sessions worth of him handpicking, sort of cherry picking the tunes he wanted to do. But that was a really fun project. In the interim, his daughter Madeline grew up and actually wound up in a duet with Neil Schoen's son, who again followed in the family business. Neil's son is a great songwriter, singer, guitar player. Anyway, he and Madeline had this duet thing going. I think it was called American Made. You'd have to check me on that. And I haven't had contact with Madeline now. I think last time I saw John, I think he told me that she's moved to LA and she's, again, man, just, she's in the family business. Sure. Meanwhile, John built a really beautiful studio in Berry Hill. Really, really first-class tracking facility that he uses for his own use, as well as, it rents out like any commercial room in town. His house engineer is a guy named David Kalmusky.
I know that
David's
guy.
Canadian by birth. He's a great guitar player, great record producer. Again, through my association with John, I wound up getting just tons of work through Kalmusky because he started producing a lot of Canadian artists and Canadian bands. And anyway, that was kind of my association there. The last thing I did with John was John did a solo Christmas project in 2017 that I played on. And I haven't seen John since. I imagine he's still out there. He's still playing Journey dates, and he's got that going on.
Sure.
But he's a just extremely talented guy, a really, really nice guy. Was a joy to work with. And even when John was producing, most times he'd jump in the piano room and play along.
I would imagine it'd be hard not to when you.
Yeah. And he's a great musician. Those were good days. Yeah.
Is it different when you're playing a session with a guy like that who's quote been there, done that versus someone who's kind of greener? It's got to be a little more fun in a sense.
You know what? John had absolutely zero ego in that situation. And if he decided to step in the booth and play, it was just as a member of the band and nothing more. I've known Vince Gill is the same way. I've been on sessions where I've had to play guitar where Vince is present. And
that's not too intimidating.
I mean, it's extremely intimidating, but again, Vince has no ego, and he would never tell you what to play.
Yeah.
He wouldn't do it. That's rare. That is such a rare trait, and fortunately a welcome one, because otherwise you'd just be there shaking in your boots, you know?
Absolutely.
Anyway, but that's kind of my Jonathan Cain story. Really wonderful guy. When he first moved here, just as I guess as a token of saying thank you, and it also happened to coincide with his daughter's 16th birthday at the time, he and his wife opened up their house and threw this party for all the guys at the studio that had been involved in this project, the engineers, the second engineers, all the band members, their wives or significant others, and we all invaded the Cain household. And he and his wife just threw down and cooked this fabulous dinner, and we just made a night of it. And
that's really cool.
It was very cool. And I'll tell you, it was also pretty amazing. John maintains a certain amount of humility, but I'll tell you, walking into his trophy room, was, oh man, this is rock and roll. Just on as the awards and all of the accomplishments that he had garnered strictly as a songwriter, just forgetting that he's part of this massive band, but just as a songwriter, was just mind-blowing. And it's a funny thing, you know, it's I think it's true in any area of life, but you realize that there are always those that will be greater than and more successful than you are. And it's inspiring and yet humbling at the same time, you know, when you witness that. I think I've kind of found that true of Nashville in general. I think it's incredibly inspiring community to live in, and at the same time, it's very humbling.
Yeah.
Very, very humbling. The talent pool here is it is so deep on every level.
Yeah, that's pretty consistent. I've heard from so many guitarists I've spoken to is, you know, a similar version of, you know, I thought I was okay. You know, I was kind of like one of the better guys in my town, wherever that would be. And then I came here and I wasn't even sure. The most common story is I saw Brent Mason playing out, and I really didn't know if I could make it after that. But the guys that have, they all said the same thing. But I kept going back night after night, and I kept listening, and I would think about this, and I would try to steal a lick here, and I kept going at it, and you know. But they pushed through the self-doubt, basically.
Right.
Which is, I think.
I happened to, back when Brent was playing the Stagecoach out on Murfreesboro Road, I went out there one night, and of all nights, I happened to be there the night Chet was there with George Benson. And they're checking this kid out, and I mean, Brent is he's on fire. It was jaw-droppingly great, and his session career hadn't even begun at that point. You know, he was just this guy who was tearing it up, and everybody in town was flocking out there to check it out.
You know Johnny Highland, right?
I know of Johnny. I don't know him personally.
Johnny used to take a tape recorder out there and put it in his pocket and, you know, get as much as he could, and then he'd go home and work out the licks, which I thought was pretty clever, actually. But, yeah.
Steal from the best, always. Yeah. Okay. Just as this is crazy little curve in the road here, but Brent Mason is probably he's a great one to think of this. in my own career, worked for years. I mean, probably 5 years of doing anything and everything I could possibly think of. Saying yes to every phone call that came in, and more crummy, forgettable sessions that I would ever want to think about again. But at some point, I woke up in the morning and went to work, and suddenly I looked around and I realized that the game had been upped. And suddenly I look around at the company that I found myself in, and it was this transformation. And it's not anything that could ever plan or could ever manufacture. It happened, for me at least. It happened very organically. But one day I look over and, oh, man, there's Brent Mason. There's Paul Franklin. There's Michael Rhodes. There's Eddie Bears. It's like, these were the best guys in town. And suddenly I found myself in their company, and that was inspiring. Yeah, very, incredibly inspiring. And initially that was, like a once-off. I might find myself in that company or that group of players just every so often, and then it became more common, and not only that group. I mean, there's a whole number of players that at the time were getting the lion's share of the work, and man, you wake up and suddenly it's like you're working with that crowd, and that was it. That was the goal. And I'll tell you, man, I remember the first session I was on. In fact, it was a record date for Kathy Mattea. I'll never forget looking over, and Brent was playing. He was playing electric guitar, but there was some song that called for, they wanted double acoustics. So Brent and I are in the same ISO booth, and they had a gobo or something in between us for separation. When it came time to the solo, Brent jumps up and looks at me and nods and says, "You take it." And I was like, wow, okay, here goes. It's like sitting next to, at that point in time, man, Brent really was top dog in this town. And again, all the guys that are in that position, they're all they're humble and they're generous, extremely musically generous. And that was a really great lesson for me at that time.
But I think everybody has had the same path, though. I mean, because Brent came to town, and just because, he had what you just said, I said yes to everything. That is so common. And
yeah.
Coming out of the business world, I can't tell you the parallels between running a business and, doing what you guys do. It's running a business. You got to say yes to everything, and you got to suck wind. And I have this saying, there's, everybody wants to get to the top, but you got to get vet. There's a vetting process to get there. Right. And it's open for anybody, but you got to pass the freaking vets. You're going to get vetted out. And if you have the tenacity and assuming you have the talent, but there's not a lot of people up there, so you can enjoy yourself once you're there.
I agree with that. And I mean, we'll just say the talent is a given.
Yes.
Without that, you don't get in the door, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
There are a lot of talented musicians. There are certainly a lot of talented guitar players. And a lot of people would move here with the intention of changing the world, or making things happen, say, within 6 months, right? Or putting a timeline on it. And it doesn't work that way.
No.
There are always exceptions to that rule, but that only applies to maybe a handful of people, maybe less, And
the exception, the reason why they get past usually has nothing to do with talent. It's serendipity of right place, right time.
Right place, right time, or perhaps not having the not having the tenacity, not either not being willing to look at it long term and to put in the time, and or not having any kind of resources or support to help them. And that means a lot. That means a whole lot.
What was your support? Like, what was your support system? And like, you know, on those days where you were like banging your head against the wall and like, you know, the rent was coming due and the wolf was at the door, what got you through? What was your support?
Here's the worst, one of the worst and the best things that ever happened to me was the divorce of my first marriage. It segued a lot of things professionally for me, but it freed me to meet my second wife. And we met right at about the time I had seriously committed to just being in town and establishing a career here. And she was doing the same thing. She was right on the cusp of stepping out. She had worked within a company, a booking agency. She'd worked as a successful agent, but her real talent was in management. And she was right on the cusp of breaking out of that and opening up her own business. And at the time we met, we were both pursuing brand new careers, and we kind of partnered up, and we did that together. And she became my support in a lot of ways. And she also, because she worked in the music industry, she understood what I was trying to do, probably more so than most other women would who worked in other professions. And she knew it was going to be tough. And the best advice that she ever gave me, and this was at a point in time when I literally would sit around the house all day waiting on the phone to ring. And she said, you know what? The best thing you could do for yourself, get out of the house and get a job. Take some non-musical work. And man, I resisted that for months until I finally agreed and realized that she probably was right. And so I did. I actually got out and took some jobs that otherwise would never even thought twice about. But it put me in these situations where I was so far out of my element. But it was good. It was healthy. It got me out of the house. It got me out of my head more than anything.
Yeah, for sure. No,
and it was really short-lived, because not long after that, the phone really started ringing, seriously. But that was it was a good head cleaner. And it allowed me to getting away from myself and literally getting myself out of the house. It allowed me some perspective and a little bit of healthy, fresh air. And when I came back and when the phone did start ringing, man, I was ready. It's almost like that gave me a bit of added fuel, incentive-wise, to really, really want to try to be successful at this.
Well, and most important, it got you out of your head, sitting around the house thinking about it 24/7, because there's no upside to that, man.
There's not. That's absolutely the worst. Yeah,
for sure. And congratulations, because I know you're coming up on 25 years with your wife. So we talked about that before, and I wanted to say that to you because that is a major, major accomplishment. So kudos to you guys.
We're 25 years. We've got one son he's 31. He lives here. He's married. We've got a 2.5-year-old granddaughter, and it's all good.
Good, man.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about gear for a little bit. I can't really talk to you about acoustic guitars because I know even less about acoustic guitars than I do about electric guitars, even though I play electric guitar. But I was curious if there's any cool or interesting stories behind how you might have acquired any of your guitars.
When I moved to Nashville, I owned 3 guitars. I had a 57 reissue Strat. I had a Guild Artist Award, which is a massive archtop electric jazz guitar. And I had a mid-70s Martin D28. And man, I thought I had it covered, you know. I didn't know what I didn't know. All the years that I toured, like most guys that I knew back then, it's crazy. This is a really upside down situation, but when you're struggling, when you really need help, nobody will give you the time of day, right? Suddenly, when you're in a high vis situation or you become successful, everybody's throwing everything at your feet, right?
When you can afford to buy all the guitars you want.
That's right.
Yeah. What's that saying? A winner has 1,000 fathers and a loser's an orphan, or something like that. You know.
I sort of played along in the whole endorsement thing back when I was touring, and I suddenly had like all this free stuff. And at the time I thought that was the way to go. When I got off the road, I realized I had a trunk full of instruments that nobody wanted to record. So it really worked very good. So I knew I had to gear up. I had to get some tools with limited funds. For me, it was acquiring instruments was a very slow process, but it was a very methodical one. And I just, I'd talked to enough people and I observed and I studied what other players had and what seemed to be required for the job that I wanted. And so I kept a running list in the back of my mind of stuff that I knew that as time allowed, I could acquire. When I first started doing that, I was so ignorant. I knew nothing about old guitars, about vintage instruments. I mean, I was aware of them. I just didn't know much about that world and hadn't studied that market. And there was a point in time when Taylor guitars exploded. And suddenly Taylor guitars were everywhere all over Nashville, and they couldn't give them away fast enough. And I just saw that as a trend that I didn't want to be part of. And no reflection on Taylor whatsoever. It's just that everybody else was going that route. And I wanted to do something different. I just wanted to sort of make my own mark. And that was sort of the incentive for me to look elsewhere. And I started looking at the vintage guitar world, and I learned about it and I studied it. And as opportunities came around, I started acquiring some guitars. This was really crazy, but for a while, my wife and I lived in a part of town, and my next door neighbor, who I didn't know at that point in time, I knew him, but I didn't realize that he was a collector. This guy was moving guitars in and out of this house all the time under my nose, and I didn't even realize it. About a few years later, and this is pre-eBay, pre-internet days, back when I used to actually read the daily newspapers here for the classifieds, because every now and then somebody was selling something, and I saw an ad for a couple of late 30s model Gibson guitars. And anyway, I called up the number and I recognized the guy's voice. It was my neighbor.
Holy crap.
Years ago. And suddenly the guy's hit dire straits and he's got to sell off. He's liquidating. He'd already sold a bunch of stuff, but he had 2 guitars. Anyway, I hooked up with him. The first old guitar that I acquired is a mid-30s Gibson small-bodied L00. Really just absolute fabulous little guitar. And that kind of acquiring that instrument sort of got me on that path. And I've kind of been following that ever since. And I certainly embrace new instruments. I think probably more than any other period of time, we're in this golden era for instrument builders. There's so many great small shop gourmet builders out there. But my passion was a little more towards the older stuff. I found, back in those days, Groom Guitar was pretty much the only dealer in the city. That certainly has changed now, but there weren't a lot of readily available outlets for buying old instruments. Most of the stuff came from individuals, and so most of what I have now really just came from kicking rocks over, and finding stuff out there that some came from players, some from non-players, but
did you stick primarily with Gibsons, or did you switch over to some Martins, or?
I ended up acquiring a handful of Gibsons, flat tops and some Gibson arch tops. I recently bought a Gibson late 50s era Gibson jazz guitar. At some point, I really I came to town with this mid 70s Martin guitar, which happened to be the worst era of Martin production, and it really was a forgettable instrument. And I'd sold it years ago, and I didn't have any Martins in my collection. And I have an old friend in North Carolina who's also a guitar guy and a collector. And I called him up one day and I just said, I'm ready to step up. I'd like to have a pre-war Martin. Let me know if anything comes across your way. He's kind of lives in a part of the country where that stuff, those instruments tend to they change hands pretty often. And within 3 days, he had emailed me pictures of a guitar that was at his house that belonged to someone he knew.
Wow.
And it was just like meant to be. I talked to the owner. I actually talked to the owner for a solid year, off and on. I would call him every couple of months. He wasn't quite sure he was ready to let this thing go. And it was almost a year to the date. I called him up and he knew he had me on. He recognized the number and he answered the phone and he said, "Okay, I'll do it." And it was a really expensive guitar at the time. It was a big commitment. My wife and I, we decided we'd partner up and we'd buy this thing, knowing that it would always appreciate. And, anyway, we were pretty much in agreement on that. So the guy ships me the guitar, and I pull it out of the case and I played one note, one chord on it, and it was like, oh man, it's mine. It's like, this is the one. This guitar is never going back to North Carolina. And it's a 1938 D28.
You still have it?
Of the stuff that I have, that's my holy grail instrument.
That guitar. Did you get rid of the 70s Martin D28?
I did long ago. Yeah. Yep. Never looked back on that one.
That's a really cool story, man. Are there any players who influenced your playing that people might be surprised to hear about?
There's so many players that I listen to coming up. I don't know if I could sort of pinpoint any certain player that I feel influenced what I do now. Although the guitarists I listened to the most when I was a kid, beyond the Beatles. I mean, it all started there for me. But once I sort of started looking at explored other forms of music, on acoustic guitar wise, Doc Watson and Norman Blake. I discovered them when I was a kid, and it just rocked my world. I couldn't get enough of Doc Watson. John Renbourn, who was a British guitarist. I think he was most notable for he and Bert Yance were in a band called Pentangle. Really brilliant instrumental guitarist. I listened to a lot of him when I was a kid. Later discovered James Burton and Albert Lee. Again, that at the time, that really rocked my world, what those guys were doing. I first heard Joe Pass and Wes Montgomery. Once again, those guys, they spoke to me on really, really deep level. Robin Ford, Larry Carlton, B.B. King, Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker. I had an older sister growing up. I remember she had this one boyfriend. I don't know, sometime in high school, and I know I was still way into Beatles, and he'd come over to the house and he'd bring these John Lee Hooker records. That was great. That was a good point in my musical education. That definitely opened my ears up to a whole nother world. Then moving here, I mean, I will say this, and I know you've spoken to a lot of Nashville guitarists, a lot of session players. There's so many guys that exist within that world that unless you read record credits, you never know they exist, And there are so many just world-class players in this town, guys that I've gotten to work with over the years. And guys that never stepped out front to be, to assume the artist role, but boy, have just had such an impact and helped shape modern music, at least that's made in this town, the way it is.
You want to mention any names?
Sure. There's a few that come to mind. J.T. Cornfloss, Pat Buchanan, Kenny Greenberg, Adam Schoenfeld, Troy Lancaster, Jeff King, the Brits, Bob Britt, and oh gosh, now I'm going blank, man. Mike Sievers, George Marinelli. I bet you've probably talked to most of these guys.
Every one of them, or I got them coming up. Just Kenny, because he's just so busy. He's the only one I haven't. But we spoke. We just haven't connected on the time or anything like that.
John Connolly. There's another one.
That name I don't know.
He's Kenny's bandmate with Chesney. Oh man, just so many great ones. Now I'm drawing blank. Of course, now that I'm trying to think of all my buddies, I'm forgetting their names.
That's the way it is. George's interview actually came out today. Marinelli.
Oh, I'll bet that's a good one.
Yeah, real good. Real good.
Yeah.
Real good. And
If you remember, this is back this is in the 90s when Hornsby first hit. Bruce Hornsby in the Range. That was the most exciting stuff I thought on the radio back in that little era. And I'll never forget, Hornsby played the Performing Arts Center downtown, and I went to hear it. And it was just, Marinelli was in the band, and it was like, that concert was so good. It was like listening to a record. And sonically, everything was just so right. And the band was hot, and man, those songs were fresh and all that stuff. And then fast forward years later, I remember the very first session I played with Marinelli, and I couldn't get Hornsby out of my head, I kept looking on.
That's funny.
Damn, that's Marinelli. You played on that record. I went to hear you. Yeah. It's such a small little world and small town.
That's funny, man. That's a good story. And he's a super cool guy, man. He's very cool guy. Have you ever sold a guitar you wish you can get back? You seem very, like, not spontaneous, like you're going to give something like that a lot of thought.
I have, but here's a better story.
Yeah.
The guitar that I wish I still had was one that my parents gave me. And it wasn't a very good instrument. It was a K archtop. And I left it in the attic of a house I rented 40 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And I have no reason why. Should have been one of the first things to get packed in the car. And for some reason it got left behind. And I've forever regretted that. And not for the instrument, only because of the connection to my parents.
Oh, of course, yeah.
The very first guitar that my folks gave me, I was 8 years old. It was 1963. It was a Christmas gift. And just like in the Christmas story, all the gifts were open, we're hanging out, and, my dad says, hey, what's that behind the couch, right? And they knew I wanted a guitar so bad. And there it was, man. It was just some little off-brand acoustic guitar. The following year, we loaded up the car. My folks took my sister and I to the '64 World's Fair in New York. And of course, that guitar went every place with me, and I took it along. And it stayed in the trunk when we checked into the hotel, and the next time we went out to look, it was gone.
Oh my God, you're kidding me.
That guitar got lifted somewhere in New York.
It was in Flushing, Queens, I think, that event.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Wow. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in New Bedford, Mass.
Okay. Wow, that sucks.
Well, yeah, but anyway, they replaced it the following Christmas. It was another, some other off-brand guitar. Those weren't that important, but the one that I left behind in that house, boy, I would give anything to have again.
You never called them up, the owners or the next people?
Oh man, the house got demolished.
Oh.
I went back there many years later, and that entire property where that house existed all got scraped, and an industrial park went up in its place. Anyway, it's long gone.
That sucks. How about musically? If I asked you, you told me some of your influences. If I asked you to pick your 3 Desert Island discs in no particular order, and knowing that this could change tomorrow, what would today those top 3 CDs be?
Revolver by the Beatles, Miles Davis, kind of blue, and the Bach cello suites, preferably by Yo-Yo Ma.
Interesting.
Those 3 discs pretty well kind of sum up my pretty much covered the range of my interest in music.
So, man, let me ask you this: what is something you've learned about yourself throughout this whole journey?
Well, I learned that I, in spite of myself and all of my self-doubts, that I actually had the stick-to-itiveness and I had the ability to make it work. I learned that we all have given talents, and it's, I think, one of the real keys is to recognize what those are and embrace them, and hopefully that would lead you down a path that hopefully, a path to happiness in life. I know so many people that, the weekend warriors that always wanted to try to pursue something more, but it just didn't work for them. Or they weren't willing to sacrifice or make a commitment to make that happen. And I don't know, I sort of found that within myself, and I really had made a commitment to myself that no matter what, I wouldn't take no for an answer. And I guess with that said, I learned that after a number of years of being here, I realized that I had grown pretty thick skin. Because for anyone who's in business, anybody who's self-employed or runs a small business, you all know that you're going to hear the word no a lot.
For sure, man. Life is not for the weak.
No.
Would you say that's what you like most about yourself? That stick-to-itiveness, the determination? And if not, what would you say you like most about yourself?
I think maybe my intellectual curiosity. I really think that's what got me here. Growing up, I had a completely different path set for my life. I grew up on the beach, and I never imagined ever leaving the coast. I grew up in a commercial fishing town, and most of my friends, families, all were, in the fishing business. And, my childhood was spent on the beach. It was in boats, fishing, sailing, doing all that stuff. And I thought that would be my life. But my own curiosity about music and about travel, some things just lined up and opportunities presented themselves, and I was willing to kind of follow them. And in terms of business, man, I never had a plan. Not one. When as a kid, man, I was pretty laid back and pretty free spirited about everything. And I think in a lot of ways that's kind of what got me to move to Nashville. This is a long way from where I grew up. It's a million miles away. And certainly at the year that I got here, Nashville was still pretty much an overgrown small town. And anyway, I sort of feel like going forward that it's my own curiosity about life is, I think it'll put me on some other pathways that may or may not involve guitar playing. I don't know. I've kind of come around after doing this professionally for so long, and there were certainly periods where I looked at the guitar as being work, and there were a lot of times when the only time I would even see an instrument was on a session. It just, for a while, it really got to be a chore. But but now I've kind of back in this place where as work has slowed down for me and I've got more free time. And now I'm really curious and I'm interested in the instrument again. And I'm really interested in studying. And there's so many things I feel like I missed over the years. Just even as being a professional player, there, you know, a lot of music that I want to kind of explore and at least in my spare time, maybe take a stab at playing jazz guitar, if nothing else, at least around the house.
You should.
You know,
you should.
I'm really looking forward to that, and beyond, and you know, whatever else happens. If it all wrapped up today, if I never had another call, I'd have absolutely no regrets. I feel like I've been so fortunate. I've gotten to do and experience I've had a great life and absolutely no regrets about any of it. And I don't know how that segues for middle-aged guitar players. I don't know. But I think I'm about to find out.
Tell me something about yourself people would either be surprised to hear or might find a little odd.
There's a couple of non-music related things. As a kid, I was a competitive surfer.
Oh, wow. That's really cool.
That was the other thing. I was really, as a kid, I was a really avid fan of music, and I certainly played guitar all through school and through high school and had little bands, but never was serious about it because again, I saw the beach as the beginning and end of my life. And anyway, doing that. The other thing, I probably never talked to anyone here outside of family about this, but when I was 15, I got excused I was sophomore year of high school. I got excused 6 weeks early to fly down to Central America to join my brother. One of my brothers who had, he had done a tour in the Peace Corps. His tour was up, and he called me up and asked me if I'd want to fly down there and ride a motorcycle back home.
Wow.
So I did that, man. I got permission from school, and my parents were cool with it. And I was 15, and I flew to Nicaragua. I met my brother, and it was he and one of his Peace Corps buddies and myself, and we each had Honda 350s. We were going to ride from Managua, Nicaragua to, well, in the case of my brother and I, back to Cape Cod.
Wow,
anyway,
what a cool brother.
Oh, he was great. He was the best. He was willing to, like, you know, let his little kid brother come down there and hang out. And anyway, it was cool. My Spanish going into it was minimal at best, and by the end of the summer, I was pretty conversant.
That's awesome. So how far did you ride back?
Well, we started in Nicaragua. We drove through Guatemala, went to the Mayan ruins in Tikal, went to Honduras, stayed on the Caribbean side of Honduras for a couple of weeks. Some connection they had gave us a beach house. We hung out. Rode into Belize when it was still under British rule. Stayed at the British consulate's place in Belize City. Then went into the Yucatan side of Mexico. Crossed over the country. We got as far as Mazatlan. My brother's bike got stolen there. So he ended up taking a bus to San Diego, which is where his buddy's family lived. And then his buddy and I were going to continue the trip to San Diego. We got into the northern Sonoran Desert, and my buddy's bike blew a piston. So at that point, I had the only functioning motorcycle. And we wound up thumbing a ride to Arizona, where my brother and his buddy's dad met us. And what was going to be a motorcycle ride all the way back to the East Coast wound up, we sidelined. My brother and I stayed in San Diego for a month or more, wound up buying a used car, and drove it across country back home. Anyway, it was like,
wow.
it was this adventure of a lifetime, for, being 15 and getting to experience all that. And, it was pretty damn amazing.
That has to be one of the highlights of your life, man. No?
Well, certainly at the time it was. It definitely gave me a taste of a little bit of gypsy life. And I don't know, maybe in some ways that kind of spawned my interest in wanting to work on the road and travel. But that was definitely the highlight of my childhood. Yeah.
Wow. Is your brother still around?
He is. Yeah. He was. He's still with us. There were 5 kids in my family. My eldest brother passed a few years ago, but for the 4 remaining, we're kind of spread out up and down the East Coast, from Annapolis, Maryland, down to Cape Coral, Florida.
Wow, what a good story, man. That is really freaking cool. Do you have any hobbies or interests outside of music, Steven?
Outside of music, pretty avid snow skier. Have been most of my life. I started skiing when I was, 11 or 12 years old in New England. One of I think the greatest things I've ever did as a parent, I was really excited when my son when he was in grade school. I was really excited to get him into the sport, and which I did. I forget, he may have been, 8th grade, 9th grade, whatever. The first time I took him on a ski trip to Colorado, and man, he just got instantly hooked. And it's great because now, he's grown and he has a family of his own, but every year I book a trip just for the 2 of us. We go out west and ski for a week.
Oh, that is cool, man.
It's awesome. It's absolutely the best. He's turned out to be a really good skier, but more than that, he's a really great hang. And that's definitely one of the highlights of the year for me.
Very cool, man. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, and we'll wrap it up, and I appreciate everything that you've shared with us, man. What's been the biggest change in your personality over the last, say, 10 years, and how much of that change was deliberate, and how much of that was just a byproduct of aging?
I'm finding myself to be much more tempered towards most things in life. I found at some point within the last, number of years, I lost my sense of cynicism towards the music industry, and in particular I reached a point where I became non-judgmental. And it took me a long time to arrive there, There's always, I think in art, in any form of art, there's always what you feel is the hip club, the hip music, whatever, and everything else is less than. And I certainly was guilty of that, but I finally reached a point where, after having done this for so long, I understand how really hard it is, how difficult it is for a writer, for an artist, for a musician. And along with that, I think I developed a deeper sense of empathy and understanding for other people, just we're all just trying to do the same thing. And you have a dream and you're trying to realize it. And to be able to just take other people strictly at face value, and everyone's contribution is different, but to just respect that for what it is and not judge it. And I can say that I kind of have reached that point. It doesn't mean you have to like everything, or that I have to, certainly. And even, at work and stuff that I've worked on, I didn't always like the music that I was called to work on. But 99.9% of the time, I enjoyed the company that I was with. And I certainly respected the musicianship that was in the room. And I can say that, like, even on the worst days, it was still a great job. And on the best days, it was absolutely magical.
Do you think being more temperate and like not taking this stuff to heart or personally, has that been a deliberate effort on your part to sort of get there, or is that just naturally has happened just, because of aging or time lapsing?
I'd like to think that it's maybe just a natural part of aging. I kind of hope so. That at least would give me an excuse for all the years when I was the opposite. In truth, you're working with, number one, you're surrounded by talent and you're surrounded by ego. And, and sometimes that can be a kind of a toxic mix when it's all tossed together in a confined space, for hours on end. So I'm going with the aging. I'm going with that theory.
It's fair enough, man.
Sort of a natural part of getting older. And over the last, maybe over the last year or so, I know that there have been a number of documentaries that have been released, on different eras of session.
Right.
And, like the Wrecking Crew and Standing in the Shadow of Motown. There's one that was done on Memphis that I've seen. There are a few that have been done on vocalists. Anyway, man, I'm watching all that and just even have more of an appreciation, for watching these guys and the role they played in history. And of course, not knowing it at the time. I mean, at the time, every day you're just showing up to go to work.
Sure.
It's really that simple. It's only after the fact, when maybe something you played on actually becomes a landmark recording. It becomes some massive hit song. But, at the time you're recording it, who the hell knows?
Just another session, yeah.
It's another session, another day. Anyway, it's, for me, at least, I feel like I've had a great ride. And from this point on, if I continue to work at all, for me, it's all gravy.
Good. Well, I want to hear it. I want to have you on again and talk about your jazz thing when you get that going. Now that you put that out there, you got to stick to it.
I'll make an attempt. Cut me a little bit of slack. Give me some time to woodshed.
All right, a little. Hey, man, I can't thank you enough for your time, for sharing yourself and your experiences and your thoughts and feelings, and I really appreciate it. And you're a real sweet guy. I'm really glad I got to meet with you and connect with you.
Thanks, Greg. This has been a real pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity.
You're very welcome.
And if you ever make it back up to Nashville,
I will give you a call.
Please do. There's a cold beer waiting for you.
That sounds great. Hey, everybody, I want to thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Thanks so much again to Steve and Sheehan for spending this time with us. I really do appreciate it. And go to everyonelovesguitar.com. Sign up to get notified of future episodes, along with some cool stuff we got going on. And remember that happiness is a choice. So be nice, go play a guitar, and choose to have fun. Till next time, peace and love, and I am out. We hope you enjoyed this show. If you did, subscribe to the Everyone Loves Guitar podcast, and you can do this online at everyonelovesguitar.com or on iTunes. And if you like the show, please leave us a 5-star positive review. The more 5-star reviews we get, the higher our show ranks, and higher rankings mean we get to continue speaking with cool, interesting guests on our show. We'll see you on the next episode, and until then, keep playing your guitar and have fun making music.